think ultimately we create stuff for people to hear it. At least for me, I know it's for people to feel something. I think that's kind of the most important part of what we do. We're storytellers.
Hey, hi, hello, bonjour, welcome back. How have you been? I'm good, thanks for asking. It was nice hearing from you on Instagram and Facebook and a few emails. I appreciate all your kind words and especially the nice reviews on iTunes. If you haven't already, please pop over and give us a rating. You don't have to write a review, but clicking on those 5 stars would be much appreciated. And a big shout out to all my friends who said they would go and rate it and they haven't. I'd like you to find a mirror and take a good, hard, long look at yourself, friend. A few of you have asked how often I'm going to be publishing new episodes. The plan, at least for now, is to do it every 2 weeks. I'd like to do more, but the studios keep me busy. So 2 per month seems pretty manageable at this point. We'll see how things go. If you'd like to connect, please visit UnFamousPodcast.com for links to our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and all that good stuff. That's where you can also find show notes and links to other things mentioned in the interviews. You can also send an email to paul@unfamouspodcast.com. In keeping with the popularity of John Mullane's interview, I'm sticking with another songwriter-producer for episode 2. So let's introduce this talented young man with help from his bio. Connor Seidel is a Montreal-based songwriter and producer who's dedicated the last 10 years to developing new acts in the Quebec music scene. After 3 years of creative direction for Outro Music, a music technology company, he now holds residency at Cult Nation, where he's producing and writing with Charlotte Cardin, Matt Holubowski, Soren, and a number of other emerging artists. After a gold record for Holubowski's Solitudes, he's now building strong ties with London and Berlin music scene, connecting Quebec artists with talent in Europe and bringing European acts back to Canada. Also stay tuned to hear some new Charlotte Cardin music throughout the show. If you haven't heard of her, you definitely need to. She's an artist with Cult Nation and Atlantic Records, and the music is courtesy of them. Check out the show notes for links. Connor and I have known each other for a few years. He popped up on my radar a while before we actually met because we'd worked with a few of the same artists. Fun trivia fact, we also both produced and recorded a few artists who appeared on and were finalists on the hit TV show La Voix, which is Canada's version of The Voice. Connor also had a string of #1 hits on Quebec radio in 2018, and he shows no signs of slowing down. I had a great chat with Connor, and I have to warn you, this one's even longer than the last one, but I promise it's chock full of music business goodness. And don't forget to stick around till the end for the outtakes. Connor and I discuss budgets, production philosophies, songwriting, publishing, licensing, why you should never work for free, strategies on splitting up royalties, grants and finding a grant writer, and ways for artists and producers to make money even today. Perhaps the main takeaway from Connor's interview is his approach to songwriting and collaboration and the power of storytelling. Without further ado, here's my chat with the up-and-coming producer-songwriter Connor Seidel. So welcome back. How'd your traveling go?
Amazing. Really nuts. Started in Berlin and then Hamburg, where I was working for 3 or 4 weeks, meeting some publishing companies and working with just a bunch of really interesting German artists. I speak German as well, so...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm like primarily German, which is great. So it was fun to be working with German artists for the first time, which I've never really done, actually making German music. So that was just a wild experience. And then I had some friends and some artists that I had produced that were performing at Reeperbahn Festival in Hamburg. So I jumped over there for 2-3 days and somehow ended up missing every single one of my friends' shows, but it's all good. I see them here all the time in Canada.
Cool.
And then came back to Montreal for 6 hours and then just went on an almost 4-week trip with my girlfriend, Kayla. We went to China to visit some friends in Hong Kong and then just did a big whole thing through Thailand. It was just amazing.
Is that your first time in Thailand?
Yeah, first time doing Asia at all, or Southeast Asia. Also, we were really unlucky. Basically, anything that can go wrong in a trip went wrong. So we had food poisoning for 10 days. Bags got lost. My identity was stolen, so none of my cards worked. So we had no money. So it's just everything that could have gone wrong at some point did. Still an amazing trip, but I'm just like a little turned off by like extensive hardcore travel,
at
least for the next couple months. But I know I'll be doing something crazy soon, India or something like that very soon.
A bunch of weird things have been happening to myself and a bunch of friends that I know. And it's like a movie. So now anytime I watch a movie, it's like, oh God, that didn't happen. I'm like, that probably happened to one of the writers.
Yeah.
You know, anything goes.
Yeah, it's crazy, especially like coincidence. I heard this crazy fact. There's something like, the weird coincidences we find that happen in life where you something with 11:11 on the clock and at the same time somebody texts you for the 11th time. These weird things. There's some crazy statistic that these things actually happen. Technically, I think it's like 1 in 10,000 events in your day is a coincidence, which somehow means that you're supposed to have 100 of these a day, but you only realize only 1 or 2 of them per day.
Yeah, you pick up on them.
But it's crazy, just the nature of like events and the way, timing works out. Apparently these things happen all the time. It's just your brain chooses which ones to pick up on. I'm a huge believer in karma, and it's basically we're living through the kind of same time for, you and I at the same time right now in terms of leaving a fairly steady-ish position and now being back in the freelancer game after 3 or 4 years of not having done that. But yeah, it's exactly the same thing for me. It was like the week I had decided that it's time to move on. People I hadn't spoken to in 4 years saying, "Hey, what are you working on? What's going on?" And now it's just a matter of choosing the right path between all of these things because, especially for people like us that have, kind of fallen in love with a lot of different aspects of music and creation and writing and production, all these things, it's hard to, find your favorites within that whole kind of thing. So when there are a couple offers coming, you have to choose, like, what do I really want to do? Because sometimes you want to engineer a record, sometimes you want to write, sometimes you want to produce. So that selection game is proving itself to be actually quite difficult, but really fun.
Well, one of the things that I've, being addicted to podcasts, people giving advice, it's a big part of it. There's also, I like to be entertained, but I like to listen to people giving good advice about what they do and how they've improved their lives and maybe strategies that they've used to get there. And one of the things that really resonated with me last year was it's almost more important what you say no to than what you say yes to. So that's how I've been trying to live my life for the last 6 months of saying no to certain projects to have more time for doing other projects or be open to things that come up or spend time with family. So yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of options, which is a good thing for us ahead of us. So I think we have to be careful in terms of what we do get roped into.
Absolutely, yeah. For me, I mean, I guess in those scenarios, because sometimes it's not even a matter of not wanting to do the project, it's just knowing that I'm not the best person for a project. So I try to surround myself at least with other producers and other engineers that I can really trust, that I try to refer as much business to as much as possible so that I ultimately the client. It's always such a weird word saying the client, and really artists always become our friends in some way.
Yeah.
But that they ultimately end up with an experience even better than had it been working with me or whatever. So yeah, in those situations where I try to say no, I always try to help people find their way regardless and try and invest the time and say, hey, I'm not the best person, but hey, there's this guy. I try and send projects his way every now and then. And we have a different approach and I know he'll be better for stuff than me or another producer. There's this great guy, Tim Buron, who works at Cult Nation. And I'm trying to send him clients that are in like the hip hop game much deeper than I am. So, just find something more suited for him.
Tim's great, man. He's a super talented guy.
He's the best. He's
and Cult Nation, I love those guys.
Yeah, unreal. Such talent and just still really young and just this real cultural hub of opportunity. It's amazing.
Well, it's cool that you're coming to that, and I don't want to sound condescending in terms of like you're coming to that pretty early. I've always been impressed in how mature you are and the decisions that you've made over your career, partner up with people and work out of more outside studios and get access to better gear and collaborate more with people. So I think that's a really smart move that you probably came to without anyone telling you that. Start collaborating with people. Like I do a lot of mentoring with young engineers. It's like start collaborating with people. Don't try to do everything yourself. Don't try to get every single credit on an album. That's not what's important. What's important is to learn from other people and be exposed to other people and their techniques and whatever, or teach. You learn by teaching other people. And that's something that took me a long time to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely, my dad was always an advocate for just always being the least smart person in the room, which I think is just the greatest thing. And it's really intimidating at first. And I remember, going into sessions and working with, musicians that I was intimidated by. Like I felt that way when I worked with Simon Angel the first time, who was part of Patrick Watson for, 15 years, because I was just such a huge fan of the music. But ultimately that, it's not intimidation either. It's more just you want to kind of be at their level and you don't really have their experience, but you try to do it anyways. But then ultimately, anytime I've been in the room with somebody like that I'm intimidated by or, that I have this feeling with, it always ends up being a much better product. And I try to, take a back seat and just learn. And then ultimately, I'd much rather be have a smaller part of something that becomes a much bigger record that more people hear, that, more people fall in love with and enjoy, than, owning this project start to finish that ultimately only, a couple hundred people will hear. There's something definitely beautiful in creating art for art, but I think ultimately we create stuff for people to hear it and for people to, at least for me, I know it's for people to feel something. I think that's kind of the most important part of what we do. We're storytellers. Greg Wells, massive producer, that's what he says he is, and he's everything. He's an engineer, and when he's engineering, he still thinks of himself as a storyteller. So I've tried to kind of assume that role as well and understand, okay, what's the narrative? What's happening here? Don't let me get lost in, the details of this plugin or this piece of hardware or whatever it is. What's the story? And then ultimately you realize that lean and having less things but doing the right things, just, it's always better, and having the right people around too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where did you get your start in getting into music? Like, how did you, you're a musician too, but talk a bit about how you got into music, but then how you got the bug in terms of engineering and producing and writing.
So I guess it just started out like everybody else. I started playing guitar quite late. I started only at 12, 13. I was never one of the, 4-year-old, kind of crazy prodigy kids. And I kind of just fell into the recording production thing. My brother and I, when we were really young, we were really fascinated. He was a drummer. I played guitar, so we would play our favorite songs. And then a friend of a friend would come over and we would record something with Audacity probably at the time, or just some, super cheap recording program and like a $20 mic from Best Buy or something like that. And then somebody else would hear it and they'd say, okay, cool, I want to do that too. And then eventually somebody says, how much do you charge? And I'm like, I haven't really thought about that.
Let me get back to you.
Yeah. So then eventually eventually it just kind of picked up, and I kind of fell into the producer role, and then and in general, just the engineering role. And I never, as much as I'm definitely a techie guy, I never quite fell in love like with the techie part. For me, it was always about the kind of the story and the message and the music. But obviously, you kind of have to be a nerd to be able to fall in love with microphones and the choices and just the way things come together in producing and engineering a record. But just working with artists who kind of were looking for guidance and needed guidance, and I didn't really know what a producer needed to be, and I kind of learned it along the way. And then eventually hitting a point where, okay, cool, now I've done a couple different styles of music. What do I want to do? And then, you have a couple minor successes, and then start working with the local labels, and then projects kind of get bigger. And yeah, it was fairly natural. I never, I wasn't at age 10 thinking like, reading the album credits like every other producer says they were and saying like, I want to be the next, insert name, It was more just, wow, I really enjoy what I'm doing, and I think I have a bit of a knack for it, and people seem to, have fun while we're doing it too, which I think is everything in this career. And then, just kind of moving forward and projects getting bigger, and projects, bigger in the sense of, better music, or not better music, but just stuff that I associate with more, and then ultimately leading to projects that more people are hearing, and that I think is the greatest joy of what we can do, is just when you read the comments that somebody who's never met you or the artist sends to the artist, and like those are kind of the most special moments for me, at least.
Yeah, the unexpected ones, because you always get that from your friends and family, like, oh, it's amazing, and they just kind of fluff you up a little bit.
That's it. Yeah,
hearing it from the strangers, that kind of when it really sinks in for me.
Yeah.
Or you got those few select friends, like after you get off the stage from a show, or you've worked on an album, and you can send them like, what do you really think? Tell me what I screwed up.
Be honest friends.
Until I know what I screwed up, then you're never going to get better. So I'd always go to my brother after a show and be like, what sucked? He'd be like, it's great. I was like, okay, what sucked? So you maybe change it around, you work on a song, that kind of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. My girlfriend is that for me, because she's very limited knowledge in terms of production and, even like history of music or whatever, but she has such great taste that I really, really appreciate. And she can just point out that things are wrong in a production or in a song, and just point them out in such a macro level way that I always know how to fix it. So she'll point out the energy. Something doesn't feel right about the lead vocalist. She doesn't feel like in the same mood or something. Like, she's always gives some kind of a cue like that, and she's just brutally honest. She'll just tell me when something sucks, which is amazing, because very few people do that.
That's a good partner to have.
Yeah, it's great. But for me, I think the most notable moment, or the first really like, whoa, because, there's always a debate. It's a fairly self-centered career, I think, creating music, creating art, considering so many things that are happening in the world.
Be precious.
Yeah, exactly. There's just so many crazy things going on, and here I am kind of fiddling on a guitar or, playing on a keyboard. It just feels a little bit
It's a privilege for
yeah,
sure.
it's crazy. But there was one moment that really made me understand the value, and it was we received a bunch of comments on Matt Holubowski's first record that I had produced with him, and the most notable was there was somebody who sent this. It was just a beautiful message, and she was going through chemo, going through like dealing with cancer, and she wrote like, I literally could not stop listening to this album, and it literally helped me see positivity in my situation and totally changed the way I thought about it. And now she's gotten totally better. And and so that was just a moment where it's like, okay, you know what? Even though we're doing something that feels a little, it's a little crazy, it's a privileged career, there is a huge way to impact people's lives. And what would, life be ultimately without music?
It's the healing
crazy.
power of music.
That's it. Yeah. That was a very special moment for sure.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about before, it made me think of before you even knew what a producer was. I mean, I'm paraphrasing and putting words in your mouth, but
No, sure.
I was the same way. I think when I was back in college and I was playing in band and working on music, and the big dream, I think, with my ex-girlfriend, we were talking, what do you want to do with your life kind of thing. I said, well, I want to tour the world for 5 or 10 years and then buy a house and put a studio behind it and be a producer. And I didn't even know what a producer was at that point. Like, I had no idea. And then later, a few years later, I ended up falling into, I was doing 4-track recording, but then, working at a proper studios and then building up a studio. But I always think about that story every once in a while in terms of like, yeah, I'm going to want to be a producer and have a house and all this sort of stuff.
Look now, I mean, you're here.
That's
which is
kind
pretty
of
cool,
Yeah, the house is, maybe in my dream, the house was a bit bigger. Probably had a pool in the back and it had a big studio
in Miami
in the back. Yeah, who knows where it was, right? But it all did turn out, a guitar
amazing.
in every room. My wife won't let me put a guitar in every room, but
Not the bathroom.
I could if I wanted to, I guess. But I guess it's just working towards your goals, and always making it a part, even though if I left for a bit and I'd work at another company to make money, to buy gear, to pay the bills, and then I would leave and do the studio for 4 years, and then I would get another offer to do something else and back and forth. But I find that happens with everybody these days, and sort of like you have to eat, you have to pay your bills,
Absolutely,
you gotta put gas in your car, that kind of thing. How do you juggle the sort of life as producer, engineer, musician, and
Yeah, well, I was working with a company called Outro Music for a while, and that was really exciting. We did that for 2.5, 3 years, and I decided to make the move out of the company, and I've been back in the freelance game, which has just been, it's been so exciting, because there's something really exciting about building, kind of a massive vision with a company, being an entrepreneur and, being in like a management position as well. There's something really exciting and creatively exciting in a completely different way. But yeah, now that I'm back in it, it's taken me a long time to get here, but I've really decided that I really want to focus on the songwriting production stuff a little bit more. So as much as before, I definitely was juggling a lot of different things where sometimes I'd come in and just be, the producer on a record, and then there would be another engineer, or the other way around, or sometimes I would just mix the record or whatever, or sometimes start to finish. Now lately, just because the projects seem to have a little bit bigger budgets, and I have a little bit more time with them, I've been in this very divergent phase where I'm just trying out other people that I've wanted to work with for a very long time, So I'm hiring a mixer, whether, maybe I could have mixed a record and I know it so well and it's basically mixed already, but, I'd love to try working with this mixer and I'd love to try this mastering team. So I try to outsource as much as possible and focus lately on the songwriting production elements. So yeah, it's been great focusing on that because it's a whole different mindset, and I find now that I'm in it, I'm constantly looking for sources of inspiration and just these kind of using my voice memos on my iPhone to record a street drummer in the streets of New York or whatever, just I'm in this very much looking for concepts, which is different because when you're in the engineer seat, you're not so much there, you're more enhancing or just finding the best solution for something. So I'm really enjoying this kind of songwriter producer spot right now, which is great.
All the multiple hats that a producer has to wear. It sounds like you're getting more into like the project management side too, and making the right decisions and not trying to do it all yourself and be very collaborative. But do you see yourself as so there's that part of a producer's job and working to a budget and getting the players together and getting the best performance out of people and, scheduling things, all that sort of stuff. But I see, and I think a lot of people see producers, there's different types of producers. There's like an engineer producer and a guy that puts people together. And there's more of like a writer arranger.
And then there's the beat maker, right? The modern day DJ producer, which is a whole other breed,
forgot.
right? Yeah, and that's something I think, us kind of now we're basically anomalies, the guys who are still tracking live drums, which is nuts, right? Or at least it's crazy, a lot of these. Yeah, because I think the path that we take for trying to integrate live musicians, and that's one of my favorite things, managing budgets on a project and choosing the right players to come in. It's choosing the right studios to track drums in, and then that's absolutely one of my favorite parts of the project. I love that, and I definitely got the taste for that from working at the company the last couple of years. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a longer path because the digital production game, it's so fast and there's new plugins and things are moving and like now you have like these 13-year-old kids who are putting beats together that I can't even think of. Like I could spend a week and these guys are creating on iPhones. And it's just different types of music, I tend to love indie folk, and even when I'm making super pop stuff or completely digital production, I try to always integrate elements of live drums or an upright bass or a cello or just whatever, just try and bring in this one kind of three-dimensional flair that live instrumentation does.
Having access to all those tools, right? And
exactly,
You're making the decision in terms of like what would be appropriate or maybe what would be completely outside of the box that would bring something original to an electronic production.
That's exactly it, yeah. But it's sometimes very intimidating when you're in these songwriting sessions and you got these guys and they have like 50 beats and like tracks that sound amazing ready to go, and it's just a different process, the kind of the beat pitching process. And I tend to love creating something when I am writing with an artist, tend to love creating from scratch because I love to get to know people, and in this kind of fast-paced industry that doesn't always have the chance to do that, but I try to force that chance no matter what, just to have a chance to grab a drink with them before a first session, or just talk about music and make a Spotify playlist together where we're sharing songs and stuff like that. I try to build this kind of common vocabulary with them as much as possible.
I think I might take that for granted sometimes when you've been working with a band for several albums or on several projects, because bands break up and they form other bands and they come back. And working with a new artist, how do you form that bond? Because I know after working on one album with a band, I know what the singer is capable of. I know where I can push them. I know when to get a better performance out of them, or I know when that, hey, that's good and that's as far as we're going to take it. Are there any kind of like tricks and tips other than you said getting a drink with them beforehand, at like forming that bond from producer to artist?
Yeah, I think the thing is not to overcommit too early. I think a lot of I know when I was starting out, there'd be an artist who'd reach out and be like, let's do an EP instead of a single, or let's do a full album, let's go for it. But now I'm totally the opposite. For me, it's like, let's test it out first, because you can have an amazing artist, an amazing producer, and, combine them with an amazing musician, and it just turns into nothing. So I love to do these kind of quick writing production sessions. Are we on the same page? Are we like at all, like, do we gel in any way? So a first session with an artist, I always try to make it this quick 2 to 3 hour thing. And if it flows, sure, let's go the rest of the night kind of thing. Or if not, cool, we tried it out, and then just try and be as honest as possible to know that, okay, you know what, maybe this isn't for me, and then pass it off to a friend, or say like, hey, I really recommend working with this guy instead, and just trying to be super open about it. And I think the second you get past that initial hump of that first session, which
the first date.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's creative dating, right? That's exactly what it is.
I like that.
Yeah, creative dating. So, if it goes well, you go on another date. And I find that first date, you always know, okay, this is going to be something that I can really build with this artist for the next year or 5 years. You can know right away. Or this is, maybe we're just going to do this one track together, and, they'll end up working with somebody else. So I think that's the best way for me to gauge without overcommitting, and, knowing that you're going to have to do these 5 songs with somebody that, you're talking budget before you've even like met the person. It's a little bit of a weird process, So I try to do this kind of creative dating process just to break the ice.
Well, you brought up the B word.
Yeah.
So the budget, and I always felt that was a weird thing too, because I didn't get into this for money, but when you're trading your time for things and you have expenses and gear and all that sort of stuff.
Food you want to buy. And
yeah, it's an expensive,
living, yeah.
And you're spending your days, producing, mixing, writing, mastering, while the artist might be off working at their job or something, and making a living. Like, you have to charge something for it.
Yeah, I guess there's always something, starting out, there was always something a little bit awkward. And the reality is when you actually talk about it, it's not really that awkward anymore. If you confront it up front and you're super honest and you just say like, this is what it's going to cost, or this is what it's going to take if we want to get these musicians and this mixer and this. I find if you confront things right off the bat, then usually things end up being so much better, and then the artist respects your time and will really, you know, value what you're putting in. But it also depends what seat you're wearing. So sometimes if you're in the songwriting writer seat, there's no discussion of money because, you know, I'm in it for, you know, writing the song and, you know, owning part of the publishing. Obviously, when there's a manager, then that always makes the conversation a little bit, or definitely a lot easier. But yeah, I think just being upfront as much as possible, and the sooner you bring it up, then the more honest the approach is going to be, and I think the more mutual respect there usually is. I started out by basically running kind of like an hourly studio and having, you know, kind of these rappers or singers come in, they'd have tracks, and I did that for 4 or 5 years, and ultimately realized that that is like the worst approach for me. And for some people that works great, but for me, that's just not the way. You can't produce a record with a clock in the corner, you know? So for me, it's always budget built for the full single or the full EP or the full album. And then I just flex in either direction. Sometimes you manage to get great things done in a little bit less time. And then you have a little bit more of a take home on the project if you worked out a great budget. Other times you overinvest on a project you love. And typically when you do overinvest and you get, you know, less money for the projects, those end up being the projects that, you know, kind of matter a lot. And
You put your heart and soul
you
into
put your
it.
heart and you put as much as you can into it. And then ultimately those projects where I've done that and I've been technically underpaid but loved every minute of it, those are the projects that have brought me the most new projects to work on. So I think it's a fair trade-off.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, how do you approach it? What's your kind of approach when you're maybe mixing versus producing? Like how do you look at the situation?
It depends on the project. You can do an hourly thing because it's not up to you how well the musician performs.
Sure.
And you can give them a basic thing because people will come to you, especially if they're an inexperienced artist. They'll be like, hey, I want to do an EP or I want to do a single or I want to do a full album. You can sort of flesh it out. And then you can sort of tell them, this is how much time it's going to take. This is how many studio days it's going to take. This is how much it will cost for mixing. This will cost for mastering. Either you want to do it with me or if you want to do it with somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So you can give them a ballpark figure and you can kind of lock into that. And like you said, sometimes you end up eating it and your hourly rate drops,
Mm-hmm.
you know, considerably.
Drastically, yeah.
But sometimes you get out of there and you have a commercial or a corporate gig and it pays really well and everybody's happy. They're happy because they paid for a quality result and you're happy because you made more money on the commercial thing, and that may give you more leeway to work with an indie
Yeah,
artist.
with your next creative project.
Yeah,
whatever
it kind of trades off, but you know, setting deadlines and setting fixed amount of time. I find it's important sometimes to lock it in. Let's say we got 2 months to work on this thing. We're going to do these amount of days. And so it doesn't drag on for, I'm sure you've worked on the projects too that have gone on for a year and a half. And, you know, it takes up a lot of mental energy, even if you're only working with that artist a couple times a month. As producer, you're always thinking about it. It's always
every
big
night
part
I
of
think
your
about the
life.
4 projects I'm currently working on and what needs to be done on. Of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to just switch on and switch off.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, locking into coming up with a budget ahead of time, like you said, that took me a long time to figure that out, and getting experience to figure out how much it's going to cost to put out a record.
Yeah.
And the type, if you're working with a new genre of music that you're not really that familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe if you have to reach outside of your family of musicians that you work with. Okay, now we're going to hire strings, and who are we going to get? And we can get these students for super cheap, but then you kind of get what you pay for.
Yeah.
And if you really want it, well, we're going to get these other professionals that have been playing for 20 years, and they're going to sound amazing, but they're going to be expensive. So it's always a kind of a trade-off. But yeah, getting the budget out, like you said before, ahead of time, being honest, saying this is a little entrepreneurial venture like every album, and you're hiring me as a consultant and whatever. I'm putting
of
it all
course.
into like business terms that might make people irk a little bit by
Yeah,
hearing
for
that,
sure.
but it is a business. I want to work with people who I enjoy working with and I'm excited about the music.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not that excited in the music, I can't really get into it. But if you get it up front, you can divorce that part. I'm your artistic friend in this journey
Absolutely,
together.
I'm part of the band. And what's crazy is definitely not to shit talk anybody, but I've found that it's typically the indie artists who are, you know, working, you know, whatever crazy jobs to pay off whatever project they're working on with you. It's those people that are always the most respectful with time because they understand the value of it. And then sometimes when you're working with a label, it's like 9 months later and I still haven't been paid. And I've showed up at the office 3 times. Like, where's my initial deposit? The album's been released for 6 months.
Yep.
You know, like, and it's crazy that it's kind of backwards how you'd think, you know, you got this full accounting team that's managing the project and is supposed to take care of you. And ultimately, like the indie artist who's, you know, working wherever, they're the one who pay you on time and they're the ones who, you know, just are are like, hey, sorry, I'm so sorry. It's going to be a day late, the payment. There's somebody I'm working with right now. He's, 2 days late on the payment, but each day was like, I'm so sorry. I had an issue with my bank. I couldn't go on Sunday because they were closed. I promise you it'll be taken care of on Monday. And I know it's going to be fine.
Yeah, that they're good for it too.
Yeah. But then 9 months later, and this label hasn't paid me. It's nuts.
I know, that's crazy. I mean, that's a common complaint and a common stress for working with the major labels or working with smaller labels too. Usually it's like a 3-month wait, and then it can extend way beyond that.
Yeah, it's nuts. And hopefully you just find yourself in a position, where you can wait and it's not an issue. And I think there's definitely a point where I faced a big kind of, not challenge of choosing, but at least this, not even a dilemma, but just having to choose, okay, this is a lucrative project and here's a project that I really love. And like having to balance those two ideas and having to make a call in which direction to go, because it's like every musician, who maybe doesn't love doing the wedding gigs, but they just pay so well. So they balance that, so I definitely faced that dilemma for a year or two. And now I find I've been really just lucky to have found the combination of those two. So projects that are really, really close to my heart and that I'm having such a blast working on and ultimately are turning out to be quite lucrative projects. So hopefully you get into a zone where that can happen. And I just hope, that can stick around a little while too.
For sure. You mentioned before too about sharing songwriting credits and publishing and licensing. And what are your thoughts on that? What are your experience like dealing with that side of the business?
Well, I think the most important thing is, as an artist, when you're working with a producer, to really be aware of what is publishing and how do songwriters split work within a band context? How have they worked in history? Because ultimately today, it's kind of a no rules thing, right? So, now producers are, asking for master ownership or partial master ownership. And sometimes an artist will trade like songwriting points or like composition points to work with a producer, which sounds a little crazy because it's intellectual property. But I think as an artist, it's just important to know, okay, so what are kind of the foundations? I wrote this song. I wrote, the chords, the melody, the lyrics. Like I'm entitled, even if a producer, flips a chord here, changes the tempo and adds like 20, in a full orchestral build, like what am I entitled to and what are they entitled? So I think it's important to really be aware of that. And, there are a couple great books that I'm sure, you can link with the podcast that have provided, can provide some great knowledge for that. And then as a producer, it's important just to be careful to not overstep your boundaries, because a lot of bridges have been burned by a lot of, great producers where, okay, cool, this artist doesn't really know what, the songwriter split is. And, I cut out a bridge. So does that mean that now, okay, I'll take 25%. Yeah, you just have to be aware and careful. But since I've been doing a lot of songwriter stuff, I try to address it the day of the session. Because, there's so many different types of scenarios. Sometimes I'll work on a track that the artist like kind of produced it and already sounds amazing. And it's my job just to like blow it up and get it to, commercial standard or, bring in the musicians, in which case, it'll typically be a production fee, or if they don't have money, it'll be a discussion of master ownership or, something down the line and in recurring revenues.
Because there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, if it's a deal, if they don't have the money, then there's a trade-off in giving you a certain percentage of, as long as everyone's comfortable with that. And it's no like skeezy, schemy producer kind of deals that people get roped into and no one wins.
I think it's Michael Brower who kind of said that 6 years ago or something. He said, there is no such thing as free work. No matter what you do, you're never doing free work, or don't let that happen to you. There always needs to be something in return, whether it means it's going to open the door for a massive other client to work with, or whether it means recurring revenues, even if you don't know how many albums they're going to sell or it's a total indie project, that needs to be laid out. But in the songwriting context, I always try and address it. So if we work on something from scratch, or there was like a guitar idea that somebody brought in and then, we end up writing something, I say like, at the end of the day, we'll say, cool, this was a great songwriting session. I'm glad we did this together. And then I'll talk to the manager and say, hey, this is how today went, and I think this is how it should be structured. And if they have any fight back, cool, I'm generally very flexible.
Cool.
But yeah, again, just addressing it right off the bat, especially in the songwriting situations, especially when you're doing a lot of the songwriting situations. And for me, I'm not part of a band or something where it's kind of assumed, okay, you wrote this song and I wrote this one, but we're just going to split everything down the middle. When you're a songwriter jumping into these kind of quicker sessions and 3-hour writing sessions, you just have to be super honest. So I try to do my best to be that.
Yeah, and I mean the band thing too. I mean, bands do still exist, I think, and hope. And I know a lot of people in bands, and that's something I think from maybe a young band or inexperienced band. splitting points, and I think we've all been in situations like that. And I've been the singer in a band, and I've been guilty of thinking I'm the most important person in the band
For
as a
sure.
singer and main songwriter. But what I've always felt is the best way, and I got some experience from friends along the way too. If everyone's putting in the effort, and that never happens. Like there's always two guys
It's like
doing
a
all the
group
work,
project,
and the other
and
guys are off doing their thing. So it's tough, but you just kind of, to get people involved and excited about this. Like one of my old buddies used to say that even though he writes the songs and produces, everyone gets an equal cut because you want people to be invested, to go to the shows and to play. And there's different types of things. You can be the songwriter guy that just pays your band to come and jam once and then go do a show and they get paid. But if it's just a band, make it an equal split, and everyone will be invested. And if there's anything additional on top of that, like you save a little bit, you save a percentage. Like a friend I'm thinking of, you save 10% as producer. So he gets the 10% as producer, and the guy who will produce the project, but then everybody else gets an equal cut. And I mean, things could be different. It could be 50% for the singer-songwriter, and then the band gets the rest of it. I've heard nightmare stories where, we won't mention any names, but then there's a band where the singer-songwriter gets pretty much everything, and then the rest of the band members get 3%. So I mean, it could, if everyone's comfortable with that, that those different scenarios, then that's fine. But I think basically a lot of the mistakes that are made in young bands, it's kind of like dealing with it. Okay, now we've recorded the album. How are we going to split things up?
Yeah.
We're like, oh, really? That's how you feel about this?
Exactly, yeah.
Get it over with when there's nothing at stake. Get it over with and come up with something that everyone's comfortable with. Because when there's nothing at stake, then there's people who are clawing each other's eyes out
exactly
to get a percentage of something. Ultimately, and I don't want to be down on the music industry, ultimately what it comes down to is the chances of anything blowing up are very slim. So people end up fighting, and bands end up breaking up because they're fighting over something that
anybody's heard the music. It's crazy.
all these millions of dollars that are never going to be there. So just like get it out in the open, get something that people are comfortable with, and then you can just focus on making the art and not falling into all these other pitfalls and traps of being in a band.
And ultimately, there really are no rules. I'm working with this kind of hip hop neo soul collective, and there's 6 guys, and then they feature all kinds of singers. So we're planning an album for January next year, and we're looking to get Russell Elevato to mix it, who engineered and mixed all the D'Angelo, and so just really excited about that. But all that to say, so these guys, they're like real session players and musicians that now have come together for this kind of one collective that they're just really cool.
Voltron supergroup?
Yeah, something like that, yeah. But all like in the neo-soul, jazz, R&B world. But anyways, for them, so I'm now getting the first demos from them for the album. And they're giving me the songwriter splits with the demos because they're so open and so cool about it.
That's amazing.
And for them, it's very clearly, because all 6 of them write kind of on their own, and then they'll bring it to the band. They've come up with this kind of arrangement where everybody who works on the track, or everybody in the 6, because they've been together long enough to have a great relationship, everybody will get 5% no matter what, and then the core songwriter, he'll get the rest, and they're totally comfortable with that. And everybody has a song that they've written on the album, and that's totally cool. So for them, that works. So ultimately, just being flexible, but at least having that conversation is what really matters.
Yeah, no, that's smart, because it's, everyone just thinks about, okay, we're just going to get together, we're going to play songs, we're going to write together, and everything's going to work itself out. Like there's record companies are big, and they have a lot of people working for them because they have a lot of people focusing in on their little niches or niches, depending on how you want to say it. When you're an independent artist, you have to wear all these multiple hats, right? You've got to be sometimes your own manager, you got to be your own marketer, you got to, go and pay for the rehearsal studio, you got to pay for transportation to the gig. All those things are important, and especially contract stuff. You got to be your own lawyer to a certain extent and do a lot of research. You mentioned a couple books there before about putting them in the show notes about songwriting and points and licensing and publishing. Do you have any off the top of your head that you recommend?
I wouldn't know the names, but they always have modern, updated versions. Because ultimately, what I think really matters also as a producer is understanding today or even within your industry, so within the Quebec industry, for example, where is the money going to come from? Is it going to be points on the record like a traditional producer? Now, basically not anymore. You can look at a book, structuring a production arrangement, from 2012, and it's basically irrelevant at this point because nobody's selling records anymore. So having points on records doesn't really matter, but maybe owning part of the masters and discussing that with the artist would then be a much more, lucrative or a fair trade. So, it's also just being aware within your niche industry, where is this money going to come from? Am I working on a radio single, or am I working on something that's going to be playing on satellite radio? How are those revenues then distributed? Who's making that money? And so, and if you're aware of that, then you can structure a fair deal. That's what it should come down to. It shouldn't be, the idea isn't, be aware so you can find the biggest chunk that you can make. It's more just be aware so that you can have a great conversation and build something fair.
There's some artists we know, it's like, I just want to make bank and this is my business and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to push myself and whore myself out in a non-sexual way, hopefully. You never know. But, that's their game, to make a business, to be rich. And other people maybe on the other side, the polar opposite is like, I just there to share my art with everybody, and because it's something that nourishes my soul. And then maybe most people kind of fit in the middle. They do it because they love it, but they also hope that people are going to come to the shows, buy their whatever. Can you explore a bit more on owning the masters and what that means?
So the master ownership is essentially attributed to typically the producer, whoever's paying for the studio sessions, essentially is the owner of the master. So if the label is paying for, the producer's time and the studio time and the musicians and the rental gear, that means that the label, and that's kind of the classic artist deal that you would see in a major label, is in the context where the label would own the masters. Now, when you're in a license deal with a label, then you as the artist who's funding your own project, you then typically own the masters and you're licensing them then to the label. So being an owner of the masters, there are a lot of different revenue streams that partially pay out to the songwriters and partially pay out to the owners of the masters. So if you as a producer are working with an artist who doesn't have money, it's a great way for you to then say, here, you know what, why don't we co-own the masters together? I'll produce it for free. Maybe you guys write a couple of songs together, so you're also a songwriter on the project. Then as an owner of the masters, then you're entitled to certain revenues. So for example, if the artist gets a really interesting licensing deal, or a small license that happens on a TV show or on a Netflix, or some kind of corporate company wants to use their song in-house for some demos for, a big financial company, something like that. There's both, depending on the context, there's both money paid out to the owner of the masters as well as to the songwriters or the publisher in that sense. So as the owner of the masters, there are a lot of different places where you can be getting the money in from. As a producer, it's a great thing to be able to leverage when you have, when you're scouting an artist and looking for somebody and you've started building these connections to potentially, get a cool license deal or get, an interesting TV series spot for the song. It's a great way for you as a producer to still find and develop an artist that you wanted to work with but has no money, and ultimately build a great brand for them and, build a career for yourself. And I love that, the idea of thinking of the kind of two extremes. I try to fit myself in the middle, of course, between those two as well, trying to be, making art for art. But then ultimately, it's really a business, right? And the second I started making that flip and understanding, okay, where can I be smart here? And that's when, I was sitting on this kind of catalog of, 400 or 500 indie tracks I'd been producing since I was 15, and thinking, wow, there's this like old kind of Motown song that would be really cool for, this kind of a TV ad. So at that point, I started thinking to myself, hey, let me communicate with all my artists and get all my kind of affairs in order and get their permission to pitch these songs, and just in an effort to make everybody money, and the cool thing, I was working with an artist, this guy, Sean, and we produced a single together. And I ended up getting a really cool license deal for us with Time Warner. They used 6 seconds of the instrumental section of a bridge, and it paid 3 times the amount it cost for him to produce the song. So he's just laughing, and he bought himself, an American telly. And just to say, there's a lot of creative ways, especially when you don't have money, which is a lot of the case, and definitely how I, started out with all the projects. Once you start building those kind of opportunities to sell songs in a different way than just, classically through iTunes or Spotify, and
right,
which is, typically not a huge source of revenue anymore.
Yeah, we've all heard of the Spotify complaints.
That's it. So then you can actually find creative ways to develop an artist that, doesn't have the money to pay, but is so talented that you want to develop them anyways. So
no, that's smart.
Bit of a ramble there, but
No, for sure. But I mean, it's something that maybe more and more people are thinking about it. But
Mm-hmm.
I know back in the day, even not that long ago, people started like licensing your song to commercials,
Mm-hmm.
and even in films and TV shows. Was kind of like an evil thing to do, and you were a sellout and all this BS that people would
Yeah.
stream about that. And then as I got older and TV shows actually became a lot cooler in the last 5 years, especially, and now it's like a pursuit that people want to. If artists are honest about that, they're like, we don't sell records anymore that much. This is how we go on tour. This is how I pay my mortgage so I can make the next album for my fans. And it's really nice to see that come like, 180 degrees.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like back into sort of like people being accepting, and you're no longer a sellout. I guess depending on who you license your song to.
Viagra commercial, or
Yeah.
you always want to find a situation that matches your brand and your ethos.
The political parties that always gets themselves into trouble because some band doesn't agree with their politics, and then they're using their song in their campaign. But yeah, as long as everybody's down with it, hey, why not?
What's crazy, it's actually built some careers for artists that we now know as, huge pop or huge rock indie artists. Young the Giant was kind of blowing up on the indie scene, but then I think they had their track My Body was on in a Mountain Dew commercial. Massive commercial. And now, like, I mean, it wasn't the only contributor to their success. Obviously, the music carries itself, but it was a huge way for them to kind of break into this international scene. It was, I've heard that song. Same thing with Ex Ambassadors. They had their first track in a Jeep commercial. And that's how I heard about them. I saw them in this commercial and was like, who is this artist? Checked them out, fell in love, and started, ended up going to their show. And like, these are all things that contributed to their career in a massive way. And all of this stems from, kind of the big, Hollywood, film producers, them saying like, we can't pay, James Brown for another one of his tracks because they want $500,000. So let's find an indie artist.
Yeah.
And so there's actually a really amazing movie called Baby Driver. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, I just watched it last week.
I absolutely love that movie, and I love the soundtrack. And I was so inspired that I ended up like cold calling everybody who worked on the movie in the music supervision division, basically just to say like, amazing job. I'm a huge fan of like film scoring and like everything obviously Hans Zimmer has done, and that whole world of orchestral music that created the modern film. But I'm also a huge fan of these kind of really cool films that are basically just using indie artists, and then also Baby Driver is using some massive tracks from the 60s and 70s.
You got Kid Koala on there too.
Yeah. But it's really cool to see that these kind of indie artists that not many people know about are getting these interesting spots in these massive movies or massive commercials that are huge in terms of them developing their career, because they can go to a big festival promoter and say, hey, my song was in Baby Driver featuring Jamie Foxx, so that's great leverage for them, and I think it's really cool.
Digital marketing, the age that we're in right now. And how do you see bands that you work with, what were the most important things to promote themselves? Snapchat, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram?
Yeah.
What do you focus on?
I think the most important is if it's an indie band that doesn't have a label that's helping manage their social media and their digital distribution or physical distribution at all, is to look into, and I'm a huge fan of TuneCore, CD Baby, and all these platforms that allow your music to be everywhere for basically zero money. They're so cheap for considering what you're getting. But I think what's really cool, and in Canada we have an amazing company called Believe Digital. There's also, I think, Unidisc was a contributor to, I'm not sure actually about, Unidisc was probably just physical distribution.
I think they're a few blocks away from here.
Yeah, they're just around here. So Believe Digital is an amazing team, and they essentially build digital distribution strategies with artists. So if you kind of pitch them your music and they fall in love with it, I highly recommend looking for real human digital marketers to work with even just distributing your music, because today in a game of Spotify playlisting, where just being on the right playlist can make or break the success digitally of your track.
Yeah.
It's important to be working with the people who are connected to these teams and directly working with Spotify and iTunes to get you a banner on iTunes with a new album release. It's important to find a team like that, and it's just a matter of reaching out. And sometimes artists are a little intimidated to reach out to these companies because they're unaware of, okay, I just need to put it on Spotify and it's done, or I just need to put it on Amazon Prime. And but it's so much more than that. And there are people who are dedicating their careers to that. So I think it's important just to go out and find out, okay, who are the people, that, I'm having trouble getting signed to a label, or I'm not sure who the right fit would be, or I want to own all of my content. There are a couple cool companies like Believe around the world now that are helping indie artists develop amazing digital strategies. And I think that's a huge asset. And I try to get a lot of the artists that I'm working with, if they're not signed to a label, to communicate with these guys and try and build something that is more than just, okay, let's throw it online.
Cool.
Yeah.
I like that. I wasn't familiar with Believe.
Yeah, you should definitely check them out.
I definitely will be looking on their website today.
Ultimately, it comes down to the great music, right? You have all these people strategizing about these creative marketing plans. And, like I remember I saw this crazy thing online. I think it was Nelly was attached to some type of, it's like Nelly was attached to the Tupac murder. And I was like, I have to click on this, and brings me right to Nelly's Facebook page. Top thing was Nelly's new album out now. By the way, he was in no way associated with Tupac or whatever,
Gotcha.
So there's all these people, doing these kind of creative things. But ultimately, like, I didn't listen to Nelly's album. I probably checked out one track, but it wasn't for me, So if the music is great, then, the marketing, I think, will kind of happen in a much easier way. So,
and you're talking about it right now on the podcast. So he's getting,
something worked, you know?
He's getting a plug.
Yeah, that's it. So maybe what I'm saying is wrong, but ultimately it does have to come down to the music, right? Like it's got to be, and I know Dave Grohl that's what he says. He's just like, make good stuff that people want to come and hear, and then, things will grow. And I'm a pretty big fan of that. I think, there are a lot of artists that, get people coming out to their shows and then start getting label interest just because their music's amazing, and maybe they just release it on TuneCore. It's just on SoundCloud, but because it's so amazing, people are attracted to it. So not to get lost in the world of, finding creative ways to release it. Don't forget that like the music has to be unreal in the first place for anybody to want to hear it.
So work with a producer.
Yeah, that's it.
Like Connor. You could play this both ways. What do you think is important, and what do you think you can forget about these days in terms of putting your stuff online? Like forget about MySpace, let's say, and make sure it is on.
Tricky question. I don't know if I'm the right person to answer the question properly. I think it depends on what kind of stage you're at in your career. So for example, there's an amazing Quebec-based jazz group called Jazz Mboka, and they're like just amazing.
Yeah.
They're winning all the awards they're kind of like an African tribal influenced modern jazz, but really at the cusp of like exploring new territories of jazz, which so few people are doing today. So they're invited to a lot of the big jazz festivals around the world to showcase what they're doing. They won some kinds of awards here at the Montreal Jazz Fest. For them, for example, being on all the digital platforms isn't so relevant. Playing less shows is played very much to their advantage because there's a certain level of exclusivity, especially in jazz world. But then when you look at like a digital artist or kind of like a modern pop producer, digital artist, why not put it everywhere? Just put it on every streams. The new day of radio tracking, hiring somebody to, go and pitch your songs to radio stations. It's kind of that now on Spotify, where you have all these indie people who are curating these huge Spotify playlists that everybody, who's studying and everybody's listening to. So like, why not go and hustle and try and get your tracks on all of these small or large or massive indie Spotify playlists? So in that case, put it everywhere. So I think it really depends on where you're at in your career, what stage you're at. But in general, I'm definitely an advocate of just put it everywhere. There's so much noise out there. So if you want to kind of surface, especially as an indie artist, just releasing your first few pieces of music, get it everywhere. The more possible playlists and the more possible blogs that are talking about you, the better.
For sure. And I'm glad you mentioned that because I hadn't thought of it. And we could talk about a million things today. And I definitely have to have you back to talk about all the other things we didn't even get into, mastering or mixing.
For sure, yeah.
Everything that, some of the cool video projects that you've been involved with. And there's a crazy, huge list. But I liked how you mentioned about the exclusivity thing.
Yeah.
A lot of bands, it's important for a young band to play with different people. I see a lot of artists that I know get locked in doing another show with this person at the same club. And
same crowd, and you're just playing to other musicians.
You got to get out there and play at different clubs, play with different bands, because you can all share each other's fans and all that sort of thing. So I think that's important on the one hand. So I'm saying that's important to get out there, play different gigs and with different people.
Do the open mic nights, do whatever, yeah.
Yeah, and also, and on the other hand is don't oversaturate your market. If you're an indie band, you're probably not touring that much, so don't play your same city over and over and over and over, because maybe some new people, but usually it's your friends and family that are coming out to see you. So you don't want to get to a point where they're like, I gotta go.
Yeah, can't do
After
the
they eat
seventh.
supper and they're like sitting on the couch and I gotta go out and see so and so, and they're playing the same songs and play a lot with different people, but don't oversaturate
Totally.
the market.
And in the same kind of conversation as that is maybe you're not in the right city. That's something you have to realize sometimes too. You know, if you're making Americana Southern music, maybe, you know, maybe Montreal, Toronto is not necessarily your scene. Go to Nashville. And I'm working with a really cool group based out of, well, they're BC and then London from the UK as well, called Zoology. And they're really, really just like guitar aficionados, make super cool music, but then ultimately digital stuff. And right now they're in this phase where they're just traveling the world. And I'm not saying that because they're like loaded and they're able to, you know, use all this money, but they're just trying out different cities. So they lived in Berlin for 3 months. I think they did New York for a while. They did BC. Now they're in Montreal. So that's great. I'm able to work with them while I'm here.
Cool.
But they're just trying to find, okay, cool. Where does our music, you know, seem to strike a bit of a chord? Where are we finding other acts that really relate to us, where it makes sense to be collaborating with them on shows and promoting events and things like that?
Trying to find their community and their crews.
That's exactly it. And, you know, they felt that way in Berlin. They loved it. I think maybe they did Nashville for a while, which kind of made no sense for their music. And they're loving Montreal right now too. So I think it's important to, you know, if you can fully invest and you can quit the second job, just go all in. Try out a different city. If you're making, you know, country music, go to Nashville. Why not do it? You know, maybe it's totally oversaturated, and a lot of people say that about LA and Nashville as well. But at least get a feel for it. You know, go for a month, go for 2 weeks even, just to try it out. And I think that can help with the whole kind of oversaturating your local market thing as well.
And seeing as I know I'm gonna let you go live your life sooner or later, but all these things keep popping up to me. But what do you feel about the Montreal music scene? I wanted to at least touch on, because I know you work kind of both sides of the language, you know, English and French. So what do you see as being the scene and the types of music that are blowing up? Are there any cool bands that for people to check out?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think I found myself kind of in exactly what you were describing. This a little bit of a cyclical kind of behavior. Same. I was very much in the kind of English indie folk rock scene in Montreal, and ultimately, like, it's very hard to build a financially viable career. And I saw all of my friends struggling in that scene. And I was very lucky to work with this guy, Matt, who ended up having some now I think we can say fairly decent success in the French Quebec scene. And that's what really opened my eyes to the French Quebec scene, which is a lucrative, thriving, healthy, active scene and a supportive scene. And so many people say, oh, the French Quebec scene, they only, you know, you have to be French to work in it. Well, I'm working in the French Quebec scene, and you know, I struggle with my French and everybody kind of makes fun of me for it. And that's my thing, you know? But I think it's really exciting right now.
Let's hear some French.
Oh non, je peux pas parler en français, c'est vraiment pas ma meilleure.
Le reste de l'interview va être en français.
No, I'll do it in German instead.
All right, okay, I'll let you speak English.
Yeah, so you know, we've seen some amazing acts come out of Montreal. I think in general, we're kind of a creator of amazing talent, but ultimately the English artists, a lot of them are moving to other cities to then continue their careers, you know?
We're the incubator, the artistic, affordable incubator.
And now slowly the music tech startup incubator and VR and for so many other things. But ultimately, I think as an English-speaking artist, if you're trying to work in commercial music and you want to stay in Canada, you have to move to Toronto, you know?
I've seen that happen too.
Or they go to LA, or they start doing these other things, and now more opportunities are popping open for them. But, you know, for me, it was more, I'm living in Montreal, which is in Quebec. Let me explore the Quebec scene, and a scene that I knew very little about, and for some reason thought, you know, wasn't filled with amazing music. But then the more I started to explore, the more amazing, talented artists I started to find. And the first for me in the French Quebec scene was Louis-Jean Cormier. When I heard his album 13e Étage, I was like, whoa, okay, where have I been? You know, why have I not been listening to this stuff and exploring? So he opened the door for me for that. And there are so many other great artists in French Quebec. There's a really cool artist called Safia Nolin, who's like really unique, kind of just, and it's really well produced too. And it's kind of out of phase and all ribbon mics and nothing makes sense, but it's just so charming. And I tend to love that kind of stuff. So yeah, there are a bunch of great artists to explore. But ultimately, as an English-speaking artist in Montreal, it's it's a tough city, especially not many people are going out to support the shows. This is talking like non-techno music, because techno, we have an amazing scene, and
Yeah.
kind of like the late night after hours scene is crazy thriving. But, in this kind of indie rock, folk, and even pop music scene that we're talking about, it's tricky.
Yeah,
It's
show bars
definitely
are
tricky.
well. There's still some that have that are still kicking it. The show bars out there.
Yeah.
Some have closed, but some have recently renovated or they've switched ownership. I won't name any names, but it's definitely a different scene than when I was coming up. When I was 16, sneaking into bars and
Yeah.
playing in bars downtown. I found there's fewer show bars. A lot of show bars are closing down because maybe people aren't going out as much and spending the money, and the bars don't see it as a lucrative way. And
they're being converted to techno venues, right? Remember Underworld?
yeah,
That venue is now Newspeak, which is like they're bringing in some of the biggest techno digital producer artists. So just not enough people were going. And I remember 5-6 years ago going out to shows and thinking like, hey, we're like 10 in the audience. Like, how is this bar making money? It's Saturday night. It's nice outside. So it's only logical to just kind of follow, where these guys can build a lucrative bar and like build opportunities. But it's also sad for worldwide. A lot of this music still exists. We still have Bunny Bears, and we still have these kinds of like indie artists that are still doing well. So it's sad to see it go, because we love it too. But it makes sense, right? It's logical.
for sure. And you mentioned the last thing I wanted to talk to you about. We were talking about money and funding and the Quebec scene and everything, and maybe the reality or the misconception. I'm not really sure I know the answer to that,
Sure.
but in terms of where the grant funding is going for what kind of artists, and I would assume that it's mostly in the French music scene. Could you just talk a bit about grant and like how can bands get the money to?
Yeah, so there are a couple different sources, and this was tricky for Matt because he makes music both in English and in French, but primarily English. But so there's Musique Action, which is very amazing for French Quebec artists. They have all different kinds of grants to help people build their careers, and these things are like hefty to fill out. Like it's a process, and they want to know about your team. They need like social security numbers for everybody that's involved, the engineers and the additional producers, and they want to see their resumes and credits. So I really do recommend working with a grant writer as much as possible, especially for Factor as well, which is probably the most renowned in Canada. The thing is, for Quebec-based artists, you're competing with the rest of Canada, not just your local scene.
Right.
So that's something to be aware of. But one thing that I think a lot of engineers, producers, kind of don't look into much, and I the last couple months have been really avid about looking into, is so in BC you have like Music BC that will fund you, but so in Quebec here we have a really cool program called the CALQ, CALQ, and they support really anybody in creative industry. So we're talking architects to artists to designers, and you can apply for either residencies in other countries. So one, like you can do like 6 months in Berlin at their house that's kind of paid by them, or you can apply for local things specific to projects, or just to develop an artist or to develop, whatever you want. And their job is to give artists and creators of beautiful things money to be able to live their lives and not have to work the second job and be able to fund their careers. So I don't think enough people look into it, and maybe that's a good thing right now for the few people that are, so that they have a better chance of getting them. But just look into it. Google, wherever you are, just to Google what are the music grants, what kind of art grants are there, what kind of residency grants will there be. If I want to live in Berlin, but I really don't have the money for the flights or for the idea of living there. There are 3-month grants right now. The CALQ has an amazing one that you can apply for at any time in the year. And you can apply for the CALQ specifically. You can apply for up to 5 a year. You can get 5 grants a year. So, there's no excuse really for finding creative ways to get money to get your projects. And again, that hip hop collective right now, they're doing a big crowdsourcing campaign. They're doing additional shows to get people money, to get money to be able to produce their album. And they're super ambitious. They're trying to get 50 grand to produce their album, which
It's a good chunk of change.
It's a good chunk of change now. 15 years ago, it was kind of a laughable budget, but today you can produce a mean record with 50 grand. And I know they're going to do it because they're just hustling. They're, selling merch and just being really creative. So I really think there's no excuse for anybody who says, oh, I can't get the money together to fund my project. There's a lot of people out there, especially in Quebec, that a lot of foundations that their job is to do this. and to help people fund their creative projects. So
Jump on Google.
Google it. Just find some.
The one thing to add to that is you mentioned the grant writers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how would someone go about finding a grant writer?
That's tricky. I've found one or two just through friends that have like amazing success rates, and they're the kind of like honest grant writers. So I think there's two types of grant writers. So you have some that'll charge you a fee regardless of whether you get the grant or not, and then you'll have some that work based on commission. And you typically want to work with them because they're the kind of people, they'll put the time in, and if you don't get the grant, they don't get the money, meaning that they'll only work on a project that they know will get the grant.
Right.
So when you are looking, exactly, right, they're only going to invest the 3 days if they think they're actually going to get the grant money. They usually cost a little bit more, but you're getting the honesty of somebody telling you, sorry, I'm not going to do this because I don't think you can get it for these and these reasons.
And they might tell you the steps that you need to take. Be like, well, listen, you're a very inexperienced artist, or maybe you haven't done a ton of shows, so go out there, do more shows, network, work on some stuff, do a demo first, and they might be able to give you advice to get you to the next step. And then the following year, you would be in a place where you would go back to them and say, yeah, I'm going to write this grant for you, because you're in a place to...
You're ready. Yeah, you have all the things in line. And I think in terms of finding a grant writer, just check out your favorite albums of local artists that you know have been funded. Find somebody's number, find them on Facebook. It's so easy to cold call and reach out to people. I do it all the time. Hopefully not in like an obtrusive way, but I do it just like looking for information.
You're
from
starting
people
to get a bit of a reputation.
It's no good. But yeah, so I mean, just reach out. You know, if you're at a show and it's an artist that you know, they're always crediting Factor. If they got a Factor grant, ask them, how did that come together? It's so easy. I really think there are no excuses for these kinds of things. You just got to do it. You just have to put the time in, ultimately. And you'll find a grant writer. Reach out to Factor and ask for them to sit down for an hour and to explain their different programs for you. Do the same thing with the Calc. I did that, and I had a great 3-hour conversation with them about the different grants and how they would apply to me. And they gave me tips on how to write my grant to have a better chance to beat the other people that, you know. So just ask questions, I think.
Yeah, I think people are scared, and it's such an insulated world too, in terms of like sitting behind your phone or your computer and not reaching out to other people. But go talk to people. They're like-minded people. They're not scary. They want to help, I think, for the most part. And if you find people that aren't willing to help and they want to hoard it all to themselves, for me, for example, I'm cutting out the last 10 minutes of this interview to keep all these grand ideas for me and my friends. But no, I mean, most people are very happy to help, you know?
Well, that's how we met, right? It was me reaching out to you like, hey, I have some questions about music, tech, startups. Or we had known each other a little bit before, but when we started going for lunch, just talking about these kinds of things and me just kind of stealing this knowledge from you, you know? I think you just got to do it. There's no excuses.
And now we have this friendship.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah, so, that's exactly it.
Yeah, don't be afraid, people out there. Go talk to people, because, you know, it's like the joke of putting 2 engineers or 2 musicians in a room or at a party together, like they'll never shut up.
Yeah.
People want to help, and people want to share their knowledge with you, and they want to see their friends succeed too.
Absolutely. And you know, it's crazy. I remember a couple years back, 6-7 years ago, I was kind of exploring the hip hop scene in Montreal, which I'm no longer a huge part of, but at least the kind of studio scene. And I was really frustrated to know that a lot of these guys were really exclusive about, you know, sharing ideas. And like I had a friend who had like some kind of a huge LA, I think it was like a American Idol session. And like I walked in while he was like looking at the session that he got from a friend, just like kind of checking out the guitar sound. And he like hid the session for me. And I'm just like, what? This makes no sense.
Yeah.
You know, and this is not to say anything about the hip hop scene. Now there are like so many amazing people, especially in Montreal, cultivating and nurturing the young hip hop scene. There's a studio called Make Way Studios, and they're doing so much of this, and I love it. But I just remember that idea of like this engineer hiding information. I'm thinking, this makes no sense. Like, why would you ever do that? Because we both have so much to learn from each other. You know, why not share everything?
What are you worried about? You think that's going to get in the way of, you know, that's going to steal from your success? Maybe you're stealing your ideas. But one of the similar stories that I have is one of my professors, and I won't mention who it was, back when I was studying audio engineering. He opened a session. It was a rock session that he had recorded in Nashville. And he had just brought up the EQ on a kick drum or something. And this was like second year when I was studying. And I was like, how did you EQ that kick drum? And he closed the plugin right away. I was like, okay. I think what he was trying to do, I hope that he wasn't just worried that some young kid was going to steal his kick drum secrets, and it would be the downfall of his career. I think what he was actually trying to do at the time was just get me to use my ears,
Mhm.
right? It's like, it's not where you scoop out the low mids, and it's not where you boost the lows, or, you know, accentuate some of the highs to get that click. You know, I think he was just closing it to say, hey, use your ears, move the mic around. But
I hope so as
maybe
well.
he was one
Yeah.
of those guys too, though.
Maybe he was, yeah.
The non-session.
I'm a huge fan of that technique in general, though. The idea of I turn like my monitor off, my like screen monitor,
Mhm.
all the time when I'm tuning vocals, or although I don't really tune vocals much anymore.
Me neither. I try to avoid that. I get the singer to sing it right.
I do it by hand or whatever, if anything, but I rarely use those tools. But if I'm like hitting a point in a mix where it's feeling good, screen is always off, and I'm just walking around my room and doing other things because it's really not a visual thing that we do, right?
We're engineers, not engineers.
There you go. Yeah, so I'm a huge advocate for that kind of a thing.
Having said that, I love using my eyes.
Yeah,
For
of
projects.
course.
I'm guilty of watching meters and checking things out. And
Well,
I
as a
sweep,
mastering engineer, that makes a lot of sense too. Right?
Yeah, I sweep through EQ and stuff. And when I'm working on a mix, I'll sweep through and find frequencies and dip them out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't do that enough. Usually when it's at the end of the mix that I'm working on, or end of the master, I'll lie down on the ground. Usually because it's probably like 2:00 at night. But I'll lie down and I'll put my headphones on, and I'll just sit on the floor of the studio and I'll just listen to the track all the way through and take some mental notes maybe. But
it's crazy how much you realize in those situations. Like, what was I even thinking? The vocals like 3 dB, 4 dB too loud. Like,
it's easy to be distracted too by looking at the screen, because your brain is thinking, your ears are trying to listen to everything, and then your brain is watching, being stimulated by all these meters moving and maybe what's happening in your plug-in. But yeah, I think that's probably a conversation for another another interview.
It's crazy. We didn't even talk too much about.
We didn't talk about tech. We didn't talk about any engineering.
Storytelling. That's what everything comes down to, you know?
Lots more to talk about next time. But this has been awesome, man. Thanks so much for coming.
I really appreciate you having me. It was a pleasure to talk about this stuff. It's great.
All right. Thanks, man. That's it, folks. Thanks for listening. We'd be stoked to have you rate and review the show on iTunes, and follow on Instagram at UnFamous Podcast. Like us on Facebook, UnFamous Podcast. We'll include any links we mentioned in the show notes, which you'll find either in your podcast app or at unfamouspodcast.com. If you'd like to reach Connor, please visit connorseidel.com. That's Connor with 2 N's, Seidel. His Instagram is Connor_Seidel. Theme music for UnFamous Podcast is by The Pines. All other music is by Charlotte Cardin. Pardon, mon français marche pas aujourd'hui. And before you go, here are a few things that didn't make the podcast. Outtakes. You're high, right?
I'm so high.
If you're not high, I can get you high. I know it's early. Oh yeah, you can swear too if you want. Feel free.
Yeah, I got to think about that. Does my brand allow swearing or not?
Feel free to swear or not swear. I'm going to try to not swear too much, because it can get out of control with me. Super organized today, Connor.
No worries.
As you would expect.
You get like 5-6 guys in here at the same time. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tight little...
Yeah. Oh, did you get the webcam?
In case I edit your shit together, make you say something that you never said.
I never said that.